before we get into today's session, I wanted to take some time to introduce our presenters for today, or our panel members for today. First, Andrew Barron is a certified financial planner and enrolled agent. Has been with John Ullman and Associates since 2017 and was recently promoted to the role of advisor. So, Andrew, thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
And I also want to introduce JGUA Director of Information Technology, Wilby Jackson. He has been with the firm since 2010. Wilby, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so again, just a quick reminder before we dive into the slides here, we do ask that if you're not one of our presenters today, that you keep your mics muted and your cameras off for the duration of today's session. All right, so just a little background on John Ullman and Associates for those who may not be familiar on the call today. We serve clients. We've been serving clients for over 45 years in 44 states nationwide. We have 4 locations, including Corning, New York, where we were founded in 1978. We're headquartered in Big Flats, New York, and we also have branch offices, one out in the Hudson Valley in Rhinebeck, New York, and another newly opened office in Charlotte, North Carolina. If you're following us on social media or on our website, you probably saw the press release that went out a couple days ago. Great celebration down there last week with our group in Charlotte. We provide comprehensive financial services, including financial planning, investment management, tax preparation and tax planning, estate and legacy planning, retirement planning, and much, much more in the comprehensive model that we provide here at the firm. And one note on the estate and legacy planning, we are not practicing attorneys. We review these areas as an objective third party with our clients' interests at the forefront. And if you want to stay up to date on the latest JGUA content, whether it be blogs, videos, podcast, Andrew, one of our panelists today, has a weekly podcast called Well, It Depends. You can stay up to date on all of our content that we're producing for every day of the week via our YouTube channel at JGUA, on Instagram at JGUA_HQ, same handle for Twitter, now known as X. LinkedIn, you can just search John G. Ullman and Associates, Inc., and you'll find us there. And on Facebook, we are at JGUA HQ. And again, we're producing content for every day of the week, and that's the best places to find that outside of our website, jgua.com. And before we get into the questions for today, we do have a brief disclaimer that we have to cover. The information discussed in this presentation is current as of the date noted and is for informational purposes only and does not intend to address the financial objectives, situation, or specific needs of any individual investor. Any information is for illustrative purposes only and is not intended to serve as investment, tax, or legal advice, since the availability and effectiveness of any strategy is dependent upon your individual facts and circumstances. Results will vary, and no suggestion is made about how any specific solution or strategy will perform in reality. And so with that, we will get into our pre-submitted questions for today's session. And getting right into it here, we will start this first question with Wilby and then pass it off to Andrew once Wilby's had a chance to say his piece on this question. So Wilby, how do you recommend managing and securing my important financial documents in digital formats?
So you want to keep them organized, right? So you can keep track of them, even in digital format, maybe a good folder structure that you can track. But if they're important enough, you might want to encrypt them. And that can be as simple as using your Office Suite's protect my document function and just entering a password so that whenever you open it, you have to enter that password. It will be encrypted otherwise. And that'll help protect your documents from prying eyes to say if they did get into your computer account, which sort of brings up the next thing. Just make sure you have a password protected computer account. So sometimes at home, you may not be using a password when you log into your PC. You always should do that. And that will also help protect your financial documents digitally. And then if you can, wherever possible, say you're saving it to a cloud service, make sure you're using multi-factor authentication, always.
Okay. Andrew, anything to add to Wilby's points?
Kind of echo that a little bit. I think that having a habit that you do regularly, so not just willy-nilly saving things, but having a dedicated spot that you know you're going to keep files in is obviously key. Just like exercise, you just want to maintain that muscle and keep things regularly moving, and instead of having things saved everywhere. Um, I also think that there's kind of a tendency for convenience versus safety. And I know I've been used to this where I might get an important email and, oh, I know it's in my email. I can go reach out for it whenever I want. But you're really just making another vulnerability point. So I would make sure to take any things like tax returns that you might be receiving from your accountant, save those into your dedicated spot, and then delete it from your original email. Obviously, you're losing the convenience, but you're taking away another susceptible point that could be accessed. Um, and then just regularly, it kind of, in addition to password protection, you can also, for important PDFs, add a layer of protection to those. You can go and protect and add passwords. The only caveat to that is if you're the only one that knows that, it might not be very helpful to your family or heirs down the line. So you'll want to make sure that someone else at least has access or knows how to get access to those passwords.
Okay. Move on to our next question here. So we'll start with Welby on this one as well. What are some of the most overlooked areas where personal information slash assets might be at risk in the digital landscape? How can these be addressed?
Uh, yep. So I think the most, you know, maybe one people overlook quite a bit is just your social media accounts, if they're public, especially. But your social media accounts, they can have your date of birth in them. They'll obviously have your name and information. They might have where you work in them. And if they're private and you're sharing it with your friends, that's great and usually not a problem. But if you make that account public, it gives an attacker or someone who wants to take your identity, it just gives them more information to make that easier for them. And then they can also learn your mannerisms because you've made your account public and they can kind of scroll through and see everything that you've done. So that's a big one for stealing your identity. Moving on past that, public Wi Fi. People connect to public Wi Fi all the time. And without, anyone else connected to that public Wi-Fi, if your device is not secure, they can get to information on your device. Maybe you have a file share that you use at home that you didn't secure in the public network, and they have access to that. So public Wi-Fi is another big one. And maybe one more would be the new smart home devices, thermostats, any Internet of Thing device, right? Even fridges are smart now. Those devices, people don't think about them. They're really convenient. They're really nice to have. They're not always the most secure devices like your operating system is, always being patched. So just another place where you kind of want to consolidate as much as possible. Maybe just pick one vendor that's updating regularly that you trust.
Okay. Andrew, anything you want to add to Welby's points?
Yeah. So another big vulnerability is now that we have to make a login for basically every website you access, just makes more and more logins. So if there's maybe things that you don't use or don't use very regularly, you might consider closing them or changing those passwords since you're not going to be monitoring them as regularly as, let's say, your regular email. Um, and then kind of following up on the hardware thing, additionally, things like routers, it's easy to think that, oh, I bought a router, my Wi-Fi is still good, that means I'm good. But that's also a place where hackers can, especially for outdated models, that can be another access point. So consider updating your hardware regularly as well. Um, and then kind of old school physical documents. There's still lots of mail with lots of important documents, especially coming in during tax time here in a couple months. So making sure that just as you do for your digital assets, you have an organization for your physical assets. For all your papers, statements should either be shredded in a confidential way or you're filing them accordingly.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. So this question we're going to split over the next two. This question will go to just Wilby. What tools does JGUA use to protect my information?
Without going into the specific vendors that we use rules-based firewalls that have lots of security features in them, like data loss prevention features, virtual private network features, and a big one is endpoint detection features, so that they can detect if an endpoint was potentially infected, and then it can also automatically respond to that if it does detect things like that. So that's a big one, right? Our firewalls are huge, and they have a lot of features in them. On top of that, we build with email security appliance with that also have data loss prevention in them and can automatically encrypt emails. So, when with if advisor or another associate, they send out an email and maybe they forget to manually encrypt that email, the system will automatically detect personal information in those emails and encrypt them on the way out. So it's just another way that we help automatically protect client information before it's sent out to maybe someone it shouldn't, a public place unencrypted. We also use security event management software. It's an appliance, and it alerts us to almost everything that's going on our network. So that one's really important. Um, it sort of monitors the entire domain and the network. And if something happens that trips one of the rules on that, it'll let IT know immediately. And maybe it's as simple as a password change for an account that shouldn't be having the password changed, or it could be a switch that's sending out information that it shouldn't be. But it's one of our best tools for alerting us to things that need to be addressed immediately. It's rarely ever used, but it's nice insurance to have. We also use an in-house vulnerability scanner. It scans our entire network for all sorts of known vulnerabilities, whether they're network or operating system or other firmware systems, known vulnerabilities out in the wild, and it will alert us that that needs to be patched, and we can follow up immediately and take care of that, and we do that very regularly.
Okay.
So those are just some of the tools that we use to protect client data while it's in-house here.
All right. Thank you, Wilby. We'll go ahead and move on to our next question here, and this one will be for Andrew. Are there any insurance options available to mitigate financial losses in the case of cyber attacks or identity theft?
Yes. So the big name you hear is LifeLock. They do lots of advertising. They have up to $1 million to hire attorneys and dig into your monitoring. Um, that said, it's kind of just an extra bill because you can actually access a lot of the same features through things like a lot of homeowners policies actually have a section where they'll cover identity. It might be an endorsement depending on the company, but it is available. Um, and then a lot of major credit cards also have this built in, and additionally banks. So instead of purchasing LifeLock, you might actually look at what you already are tapped into and look at the additional features for identity monitoring through those, opposed to strictly buying another policy. Um, Realistically, I think we have a tendency to think that there's an army of people over computers, trying to hack into our data. But realistically, and I think Wilby can echo this, but close to 9 and 10 are actually user error. It's people clicking on things that they shouldn't be, answering phone calls they shouldn't be, things along those lines. So while it may be good to have some of these features, realistically, I think uh, kind of just taking things slowly. Is this suspicious? Is this normal? Asking yourself those basic questions is probably the best defense you could have initially.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on here to our next two questions. Will go to just Wilby. What are some of the latest trends in cybersecurity threats, and how can I stay ahead of these risks?
So we've touched on, at least one of these prior. The Internet of Thing devices, your smart devices, those are a huge trend. and they have been over the year, and it looks like they'll continue to be over the next year, just because the vendors aren't as good at keeping them up to date and security patching them as our historical operating systems are. So those are big, and they're an attack vector that's very popular right now. Per Andrew's last answer about it's more about clicking links and email phishing and that sort of thing. Social engineering is huge. One of the big scams we've seen over the past year are tech support scams. So you'll get a call from someone, maybe claiming they're from Microsoft, saying, "Oh, we've detected a problem on your PC." And then they proceed to get you to let them into your PC, and they probably are installing malware at that point and showing you things that are wrong, running a script, to alarm you, working up panic, and then trying to get you to pay them to fix this problem. And what they're really doing is collecting credit card information and taking advantage of you completely. I have a personal story for this one. I have family that fell prey to this about, I don't know, maybe a year ago or so. And they gave up all of their credit card numbers to the scammer because they were so worried about their PC. And then, of course, after sleeping on it and when worrying about what they had done, they finally contacted me, and we walked through everything. And, there's a long process of getting all your credit cards replaced after that. And, your PC has to be completely rebuilt at that point. You don't want to take any risk that there's lingering malware on the PC that may have been installed, and it just becomes a huge problem. So just being aware of unsolicited calls like that can be very helpful in mitigating these risks, right? Like if you didn't solicit help from a company for either PC or anything, it's best to just hang up the phone or not answer it at all, because it's very likely that it's some sort of scam just trying to collect your personal information. And then another one is ransomware is still at the top of the list. It has been for a long time. It's still very high on the list of current cybersecurity threats, and it's also one of the most damaging ones, because you have sort of two choices, maybe three, when something like that happens. You either pay the ransom so that you can get your private data back. And then that's not to say that they won't keep your private data as well. They're just letting you unlock your own data for a price. You can restore from a backup, but again, these attackers likely still have your data in that situation. So yeah, ransomware is a big one, and it's a big money maker. And the most current trend on that is you don't even have to be a skilled hacker to do these now. They basically set them up as cloud services, and they're allowing just anyone to pay for that service to then, use against regular citizens. So it's still at the top of the list. It's still very big. It's a huge moneymaker, and I don't see that going away anytime soon. And like Andrew said, social engineering, the phishing, the vishing, the smishing, all of the ishings, they're all right at the top of the list as the highest cybersecurity threats. And the best way to protect yourself is to not click links. Like Andrew said, don't even open unsolicited emails or emails you're not expecting, that you don't trust the sender, or at least know that it was coming. It's best to avoid those if possible.
All right, and now we'll move on to our next question, again, just for Wilby. How do you suggest I evaluate the security and credibility of new fintech apps or platforms for managing my personal finances?
So it's a very good question, and it's a little bit tough to answer because it's hard to find an answer sometimes. If there is a new fintech app that you want to try out, my best suggestion is you find out if they have a cybersecurity policy publicly available on their website, or through written communication. So if you can communicate with them and ask them to send their cybersecurity policy, that's great. It's nice to know if they have to follow some sort of governing body. Credit card companies, for instance, need to be PCI compliant, which lets you know that they have to pass certain cyber security landmarks in order to get that compliant registration with PCI, or there's some ISO compliances. So I would suggest you try to find out if they have a regulating body, and then you'll know that they have to follow certain procedures to secure your information. And then some other, just basics for any website. Make sure their connections are secure on every page. You want that HTTPS, not the HTTP, and the S with a valid certificate, which is usually lit up. You got a nice lock or a green lock that shows you that is valid. You can look into the certificate a little bit more if you like, but that generally the browser will do a good job in telling you if that's a secure site or not. So it's just something to make sure of. And then also, if it's a financial website, you always want to make sure that they have multi-factor authentication available. If they don't, they're probably not taking all the steps that they can to secure your data.
Okay. We will move now to our next question. This one is just for Andrew. Are there specific software or tools you recommend for securing financial information at home?
So I don't know who asked this, but I'm actually for tools, I would actually say it's better to have hard copies. So the important financial documents, things like social security cards, birth certificates, deed to your house, are all physical objects, and I would want to have all those in a firebox. You have it locked up, but at least it's safe, it's locked, and you know where it is. In addition, in that firebox, you could put a hard drive, so you have a backup besides your computer that has a list of all of your important documents. So if something were to happen, that would be readily available. And then kind of following the theme of how to protect yourself, the Postal Service this year actually came out and said, do not mail checks in the mail anymore. Even though we think of it as an old technology, people have actually been getting more sophisticated with check embezzling, and we've seen people being able to basically melt off the ink from a piece of paper, let the paper's flawless, and then be able to rewrite anything they wanted. We actually even had a client at the firm who took it directly to a post office, and even that wasn't secure enough. Additionally, as we're approaching retirement, we want to make sure that our Social Security checks are accurate. And if you actually go to the Social Security Administration's website, they tell you that they cannot be trusted, and therefore you should retain all of your W-2s until you claim Social Security. And for a lot of people, that's quite many years of saving paper, which can be difficult. So another route around this would be going to the SSA website and setting up an account. And then every year after you file your taxes, make sure that they have the same numbers that you do. This keeps you as a nice little annual audit, because you only have 3 years to let them know that they made a mistake if they did. So if you find a mistake in year 5, there's nothing you can do about it. So it's important to have a regular habit of checking in. But instead of having decades of your W-2 statements, it's probably a lot easier to maybe keep 2-3 years, but regularly check in with the SSA website to make sure that the information is accurate.
Okay, we'll move on to our next question here. This one is just for Wilby. Best practices in changing my passwords, two-factor authentication. Sorry, I butchered that.
That's okay. So what we would recommend is following the NIST guidelines, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. But I can summarize, what those are briefly here. They suggest using long passwords over shorter, complex passwords. So instead of doing uppercase, lowercase, exclamation point, they suggest using a longer password. They're harder to crack. They also suggest that you don't change your password as often as prior. Their last recommendation was every 90 days. The new recommendation is once a year, because they found that when you force someone to change their password every 90 days, they tend to not change the whole password. They just change a character at the end or add a character at the end, and that's much less secure than an all new password. So their new recommendation is to change it less often, and just make it longer of a password and less complex, so that you are actually changing that password instead of just adding to it or removing from it. And then one other thing that I would recommend that's not in the NIST guidelines is to check the password you want to use against a known password list. So there's a few sites out there. Some of them are paid. There's one out there from a security researcher that he does this as part of his job. He collects all of the data on the black market. So if a site has been hacked and the information is being sold on the black market, he collects all this. He combines it all together. He hashes the found passwords, and then he saves them in a database. And then you can go and check your password to see if it's in that database. It's a good idea before using a password that you sort of check it out first and see if it is in use already. And you can do the same thing with your email. So just to see if you have, shown up on one of these lists in the past, you can check the same thing at those sites too. So that's always a good idea as well. Just check the password you want to use, make sure it's not in a known database already.
Okay, so this next question is going to be for both Andrew and Wilby. So we'll start with Wilby and then jump over to Andrew. What are some of the best practices for securing personal devices used for work, especially when it involves financial transactions and information? So we'll start with Wilby.
So it's not going to be any different than what you should be doing for your own personal device anyway. In order to protect your device and your information, it should be the same thing for work. And those best practices are, we've already talked about it. Have a firewall. Wi-Fi routers come with a firewall in them, so you should have one of those. On your personal computer, you should always have passwords on your account when you're so you need to log in. You should keep your operating systems up to date. That's very important. There's always security patching. It happens at least monthly. So you'll get the most up-to-date patches. That's very important. Running a malware/antivirus software on a regular schedule and using one that has real-time scanning is also a very beneficial thing. So if you're using Windows, it comes with one already built in and it already runs on a regular schedule. But you should add schedules to run it daily, weekly, monthly, and that will just help keep you as safe as you can be. So securing your device for use with your employer, even if they're financial services employer, are the same as you should be doing for your own protection, right? Just keeping everything patched up to date, not installing software that you don't trust, or it's from a vendor that you don't know. So having reputable vendors are a very important thing to have. So those are just the standard best practices. And if you do those things, you are reasonably secure against bad things happening.
Andrew, anything to add?
I guess I would just add, if possible, I would try and keep them as separate devices, just because it's easy to muddle things up or forget, am I answering a work call or a personal call? Just because you're making it more complicated. If you can keep it separately, where this is strictly work and this is strictly personal, I think there's less likely for things to overlap and accidentally cross over. And then kind of initially, there's also Bluetooth. I think a lot of us just leave our Bluetooth on, kicks the car really easily. But that is another thing where you're making yourself accessible to outside sources. Someone can just access your things through Bluetooth. So you might consider turning that off as well, especially for a work-related device.
All right, so for this last question, this is our last pre-submitted question of our session today. So now would be a good time if you do have any questions that you've come up with during the session. Again, you can submit those in the chat. And once we do finish this last question, you will have a link to a brief feedback survey come through in the chat from Amelia. It does mean a lot to us, to get your feedback and to hear what you have to say about these sessions so that we can make them better in the future. But getting into our last question here, this one will be just for Andrew. In order to protect myself from identity theft, I've frozen my credit at the three major reporting agencies and also have LifeLock to monitor my finances. Can you offer your expertise on this with other recommendations/criticisms?
So I knew this question was coming at the end, which is one of the reasons we hadn't talked about freezing your credit. But this is an excellent way to protect yourself. It makes it so no one can open up a credit card or anything like that in your name without you knowing about it. So, they can't even do it. So you have to go in, call the companies. There's three. They're all work differently, and you have to go in and freeze them each individually. But it makes it inaccessible without you going in and unfreezing it. It takes about a 24-hour period, so it's not instant, but people aren't usually readily accessing credit cards or loans without knowing in advance anyway. Um, the LifeLock piece, once again, if it helps you sleep at night, I think it can be great, but it kind of also can just be an additional bill. And those same services may be available through your credit card or banks or even homeowners insurance, and you're already either paying for them or they come as a perk of having those accounts versus this additional bill. And then, kind of realistically, it's once again, everything really comes back to you. Make sure that you're taking pace with things. Are you being cautious? For whatever reason, we often think of the older generations as being big targets, but Gen Z is actually the most susceptible to scams. So just because they grew up in the internet and they think that they're bulletproof, and that's what actually gets you into trouble. So just kind of slow down, thinking of things are this usual? Is this out of the usual? Did someone call me? Did I call them? Taking that into consideration is your best line of defense realistically, because unless you're a celebrity or a major target, typically you aren't on a hot list of people. It's more that they're shotgun approach, sending lots of random emails that might appear to come from your boss or someone you know, and then making you susceptible that way.
Right. Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Wilby, for taking the time to answer these questions that folks submitted. And again, thank you all for attending. In the chat here shortly, you will see the message come through from Amelia with the link to our feedback survey. I know I sound like a broken record, but we really do dive into that feedback and try to make these as beneficial for the group here as we possibly can. So I do see we have one question that was submitted in the chat here. I'll give another couple minutes for folks to submit questions if they do have one, so we can do them all at once. But again, thank you all for attending and submitting those questions ahead of time. And again, we'll give a couple minutes here for additional questions. I do know we have one in there, but we'll give a couple minutes for any additional to come through. Okay, so we will go ahead and dive into this question quickly. We'll start with Wilby, and then Andrew, if you want to jump in and provide any additional feedback, you can do so. So the question is, Google has recently sent a message that they are going away from passwords as default for sign-in. Can you discuss what they are replacing these with? Are they biometrics or hardware?
Without seeing the email, I can generally say that they are pushing it's hardware, right? So if your mobile device is capable, it already has a key in it. And you may have heard of a YubiKey in the past. They're similar to that. You can also buy specific key devices from Google if you want to. And it's another way of saying, this is definitely you because you have this hardware device that says this is you, along with what you know, which is usually your password. So they might be doing away with passwords, but what they're doing is reinforcing multi-factor authentication. So they'll still have something else that they're doing, whether they just send you a message on your device and then you have to type a code into the web browser after that. They're getting away from passwords, but I imagine they'll still use them for a very long time as part of the multi-factor authentication. I don't think they're going to get rid of them completely anytime soon.
Okay, Andrew, anything to add there?
I don't have a lot to add on this specific question, although maybe would echo that if you have biometrics to unlock your phone and things, that is obviously more secure than a 4-digit code.
Yeah.
But I think with Google in particular, this particular question, and I don't know for sure without seeing the message that they received from Google, but I would say that this is trying to get people to use their already owned mobile phone that has a key built into it for part of that multi-factor authentication.